Captain Dorian Vale stood on the bridge of the Storm Rider, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of stars stretched out before him. The cool hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the walls, a familiar rhythm that had long ago become a comfort to him. Yet tonight there was an unfamiliar edge to the silence, a weight that pressed down on his thoughts as he stared out into the black void. This was supposed to be a routine mission, another in a long line of dangerous but necessary assignments. Dorian had survived hundreds of them, navigating the chaos of galactic conflicts with the skill of a master tactician and the grit of a hardened warrior. But there was something about this mission that unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite define. Maybe it was the stakes, maybe it was the stakes. No, that wasn't it. He had been on high-stakes missions before. But this time, there was a different kind of pressure, one that felt personal despite the distance between him and the objective. He sighed and shifted his weight, turning to the holographic display hovering in the center of the bridge. The image of Princess Seraphina flickered before him, a portrait of grace and strength that belied the danger she was in. The heir to the Vialoran Empire, the most powerful force in the galaxy, had been captured by the Rakta Dominion, a brutal faction known for its cruelty and technological prowess. They wanted to use her as a pawn in a larger game, one that could tip the balance of power in their favor. Dorian had read the reports, studied the intel, and formulated a plan. He was prepared, or at least he told himself he was. But there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach that refused to be ignored. "Captain," came a voice behind him, sharp and efficient. It was Lieutenant Cara Lorne, his second in command and one of the best tactical minds in the fleet. She stepped forward, her uniform pristine, her expression cool and collected. "The team is ready. We're approaching the outer perimeter of the Rakta stronghold." Dorian nodded, his fingers tightening slightly around the railing as he took a deep breath. "Good. Keep us on course. I want a full report on enemy positions and defenses in the next 10 minutes. "Understood." Cara saluted, her boots clicking sharply as she turned and left him alone with his thoughts once more. The mission was straightforward in theory. Infiltrate the Rakta stronghold on the remote planet of Zionus, extract the princess, and get out before the Rakta could launch a full-scale assault. Dorian had handpicked his team, an elite group of soldiers trained for stealth and precision. They were the best of the best, and under normal circumstances he would have been confident in their success. But as the Storm Rider neared the planet's atmosphere, he couldn't shake the sense that something was about to go wrong. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now, every instinct he had was screaming at him to be ready for the unexpected. The doors to the bridge slid open again, and this time it was Sergeant Tain, his demolitions expert, who entered. Tain was built like a tank, his broad shoulders and imposing frame making him seem larger than life. He was as tough as they came, and Dorian had relied on him to get out of more than a few tight spots over the years. "We're in position," Cap Tain said, his voice a low rumble. "Teams prepped and waiting for your orders." Dorian gave a curt nod and turned to the display once more. "Good. We hit them hard and fast. No mistakes." Tain grinned, a flash of white teeth against his dark beard. "With all due respect, Cap, mistakes aren't really our style." The captain couldn't help but smirk. "Let's hope that holds true." As the Storm Rider descended through the planet's atmosphere, the air around them shimmered with heat, and the surface of Zionus came into view, a barren, rocky wasteland dotted with jagged peaks and vast stretches of desert. In the distance, the Rakta stronghold loomed like a dark fortress, its spires rising against the blood-red sky. It was a formidable structure, heavily fortified and bristling with weapons designed to repel any attack. But Dorian wasn't planning on an attack, not yet anyway. This was an extraction mission. Stealth was their greatest weapon, and surprise was their only advantage. "Take us in low," Dorian ordered, his voice calm but firm. "We need to get close enough to deploy without alerting their sensors." The ship dipped lower, skimming the rocky terrain as it approached the fortress. The Storm Rider's cloaking systems hummed to life, rendering the vessel nearly invisible to enemy scanners. As they neared the drop zone, Dorian turned to his team, who were gathered in the small briefing room just off the bridge. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice carrying the authority of years of command. "We go in silent. Tain, you're on demolitions. Take out their perimeter sensors and create a diversion when we're ready to extract. Cara, you and I will secure the princess. The rest of you cover our escape. We have one shot at this, and we're not sticking around for a fight. Clear." There was a murmur of agreement, and Dorian could see the determination in their faces. These were soldiers who had fought by his side through some of the worst battles imaginable. They trusted him, and he trusted him. "Let's move." The team suited up, their black armor glinting in the dim light of the hold. Dorian strapped on his own gear, feeling the familiar weight of his weapons at his side. He double-checked the tactical map one last time before giving the signal. The ship's bay doors slid open, revealing the desolate landscape below. They dropped silently, one by one, descending through the thin atmosphere on anti-grav harnesses. The ground rushed up to meet them, and within seconds they had landed in the shadow of a massive rock formation just outside the fortress. Dorian crouched low, scanning the area for movement. The air was dry and still, the only sound the faint hum of the fortress energy shields in the distance. He motioned for the team to follow, and they moved quickly, their boots making no sound against the hard ground. As they approached the fortress, Dorian's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what was to come. They slipped past the first set of defenses undetected, thanks to Tane's careful sabotage of the outer sensors. But as they neared the entrance to the inner compound, something went wrong. A soft click echoed in the silence, and Dorian's eyes widened in alarm. Before he could react, the ground beneath them erupted in a burst of light and sound. Explosions tore through the air, and the night was suddenly alive with the crackle of gunfire. "Ambush!" Dorian shouted, diving for cover as enemy troops poured out of the fortress. His team responded with precision, returning fire and holding their ground, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. "Cap, we've been set up," Tane growled over the comm, his voice tight with anger. "They knew we were coming." Dorian gritted his teeth, firing off a shot that took down a Rakta soldier in the distance. "Fall back. We need to regroup." But even as he gave the order, he knew they were trapped. The Rakta forces were closing in fast, and their escape routes were cut off. The mission was falling apart, and the princess was still somewhere inside the fortress. His mind raced, searching for a way out. They couldn't afford to fail. Not now, not when they were so close. Captain Kara's voice crackled in his ear, urgency lacing her words. "I've located the princess. She's in the North Tower, but we don't have much time." Dorian cursed under his breath, making a split-second decision. "Tane, create a distraction. Kara, you're with me. We're getting the princess out of there." Without waiting for a response, he sprinted toward the fortress, weaving through the chaos of battle as the Rakta forces closed in. His focus narrowed to a single point: get to Serafina, no matter the cost. They reached the North Tower moments later, slipping through a side entrance as Tane's explosions rocked the compound, drawing the enemy's attention. The hallways were dimly lit, the cold steel walls echoing with the distant sounds of combat. Dorian's pulse quickened as they neared the holding cell. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but when the door slid open, revealing the figure inside, he felt a jolt of surprise. Princess Serafina was nothing like he had imagined. She stood tall and composed, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders like liquid moonlight. Her violet eyes met his with a mixture of defiance and relief, and there was an undeniable strength in her gaze, despite the chains that bound her wrists. "You must be Captain Vale," she said, her voice calm, almost serene, as if she hadn't just been rescued from the clutches of a brutal enemy. Dorian stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "We don't have much time. Can you walk?" She nodded, and he quickly freed her from the chains. As she stepped toward him, Dorian couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. This was no helpless royal, she was a force to be reckoned with. "Let's go," he said, leading her out of the cell. But even as they made their way toward the exit, he knew the real challenge was only just beginning. The mission was far from over, and so was the story that had just begun. The night sky above Ixianis was heavy with the dull roar of distant explosions and the hum of Rakta drones circling overhead. Captain Dorian Vale's breathing was steady, controlled, but beneath the surface, his senses were sharp with tension. Each step he took was calculated, his body brimming with an alertness that came from years of surviving in hostile environments. The Princess Serafina moved beside him with surprising grace for someone so newly freed from captivity, her long silver hair now tied back, her eyes focused on the path ahead. For the past hour, they had been navigating through the jagged canyons surrounding the Rakta stronghold, using the rocky terrain as cover while the enemy scrambled to re-establish control after Tane's explosive diversion. The plan had worked at least for now. Tane and the rest of the squad had created enough of a distraction to give Dorian and Seraphina a head start, but they were far from safe. "We need to move faster," Dorian muttered, scanning the horizon for any signs of approaching Rakta soldiers. His voice was low, but his urgency was clear. Seraphina, still calm despite the circumstances, quickened her pace without complaint. She hadn't spoken much since they'd escaped her cell, just a few terse words of thanks, nothing more. Dorian had expected more questions, perhaps even panic, but the princess had remained eerily composed. It was as if she had accepted the danger as just another part of her reality, and that unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. "How far until we reach your extraction point?" she asked, her tone businesslike, as if this were nothing more than a diplomatic meeting rather than a life-or-death escape. Dorian glanced down at the map projected on his wrist communicator. They had covered good ground, but the terrain ahead was more treacherous. Sharp cliffs and deep ravines lay between them and the extraction zone where the Storm Rider would be waiting to pick them up. To make matters worse, the Rakta forces were sure to regroup soon, and with their advanced scanning technology, it wouldn't take long for them to track the two down. "Too far for comfort," Dorian replied, his eyes flicking to the distant horizon. "If we can make it through the canyon pass before dawn, we should be able to reach the extraction point undetected. But that's a big if." Seraphina nodded but didn't respond. Her face remained impassive, though Dorian didn't miss the way her gaze lingered on the distant drone lights that flickered like cold, synthetic stars above them. They pressed on in silence for several more minutes, the tension between them thickening with every step. Dorian kept a sharp eye on their surroundings, but his mind kept drifting to the woman beside him. She was an enigma, this princess so unlike any royal he'd ever met. He had expected someone fragile, perhaps even haughty, but Seraphina carried herself with an unshakable strength, her movements precise and purposeful, despite the danger. It was hard not to admire that, even if she was keeping something locked away behind those violet eyes. After a time, Dorian couldn't take the silence any longer. He glanced at her, keeping his voice low. "I've seen soldiers break under less pressure. You seem unusually calm for someone who was just a hostage." Seraphina didn't look at him. Would panicking help? Her response was so matter-of-fact that Dorian almost laughed. Almost. He wasn't sure what he had been expecting, perhaps some confession of fear or worry, something to remind him that she was just as human as anyone else in this galaxy. Instead, he got logic. Cold, unwavering logic. "I suppose not," he said, adjusting the strap on his rifle. "But it's not just about panic. I've seen people fall apart in situations like this. You haven't even flinched." Seraphina finally turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. "I learned long ago that flinching doesn't save lives, Captain. Action does." There was a pause, and Dorian could hear the faint sound of wind whistling through the jagged cliffs above them. For a moment her words hung between them, heavy with something unspoken. "Fair enough," Dorian muttered, turning his attention back to the path ahead. "But action only gets you so far. Sometimes survival is about more than just what you do. It's about why you do it." Seraphina didn't respond, but Dorian could feel her considering his words, as if they were cutting deeper than she would ever admit. Hours passed, and the darkness around them seemed to thicken, pressing down on them as they weaved their way through the canyon. The rock walls on either side loomed high, casting long shadows that flickered with the movement of Rakta drones overhead. The sound of distant battle had faded, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, heavy with the promise of danger. Dorian led the way, his every step carefully measured to avoid loose rocks or unstable ground. Seraphina followed close behind, her breathing even, her steps just as quiet. They had fallen into a rhythm of sorts, moving in unspoken synchronicity as they navigated the treacherous terrain. Suddenly, the faint hum of a drone grew louder, closer. Dorian froze, holding up a hand to signal Seraphina to stop. She halted immediately, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the sky. The drone was patrolling just above the canyon walls, its searchlights sweeping the ground below. "Down," Dorian whispered, dropping into a crouch and pulling Seraphina down beside him. They huddled together in the shadow of a large boulder, the cold rock pressing against their backs. Dorian's pulse quickened as he watched the drone's light creep closer, inching toward their position with eerie precision. Seraphina remained completely still, her breath barely audible. Dorian could feel the tension radiating from her, but she didn't move, didn't speak. She was like a statue, composed, controlled, as if she had been trained for this. The light passed over them, lingering for a moment that felt like an eternity. Dorian's hand instinctively went to his weapon, ready to fire if necessary. His mind raced with a dozen different plans, none of them good. If the drone detected them, they were finished. But after what felt like hours, the light moved on, sweeping across the canyon floor before the drone ascended back into the sky. The hum of its engines faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of Dorian's heartbeat pounding in his ears. He let out a slow breath, glancing at Seraphina. That was close. She nodded but said nothing, her eyes still fixed on the sky. Dorian shifted his weight, easing out of the crouch. We need to keep moving. If they deploy more drones, we'll have a harder time staying hidden. Seraphina stood, dusting off her hands. Then let's not waste time. For a moment, Dorian studied her, searching for something behind that calm exterior. Was it fear? Determination? Something else entirely? Whatever it was, she wasn't going to show it, not yet. They continued their trek through the canyon, the silence between them now more charged, as if both of them were waiting for something, anything to break the tension. And then it happened. A sharp crack echoed through the canyon, followed by the unmistakable whine of blaster fire. Dorian spun around just in time to see a group of rock-tusk soldiers descending from the cliffs above, their weapons trained on him and Seraphina. His instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed Seraphina's arm and pulled her behind a rock for cover as blaster bolts scorched the air around them. "Stay low," he shouted, drawing his own blaster and returning fire. The narrow canyon walls amplified the sound of battle, the sharp bursts of energy ringing in Dorian's ears as he ducked behind cover. Seraphina crouched beside him, her eyes flashing with something close to frustration. "How many?" "Too many," Dorian growled, peeking over the rock to assess the situation. There were at least a dozen soldiers, their armor gleaming in the moonlight as they moved in perfect formation. The rock were nothing if not efficient. "We need to get to higher ground," Seraphina said, her voice cool and steady. "We're sitting targets down here." Dorian fired off another shot, taking down one of the soldiers, but it wasn't enough. They were being flanked, and he knew they couldn't hold this position for long. "Higher ground," Dorian muttered, glancing up at the steep canyon walls. It wasn't an ideal plan, but she was right, staying here would get them killed. "All right, stay close. We're going to have to make a run for it." Without waiting for her to respond, Dorian surged forward, firing as he moved. Seraphina followed, her movements swift and agile as they darted between rocks and boulders. The rock-tusk soldiers pressed in from all sides, but Dorian's aim was precise, each shot finding its mark as he cleared a path toward a narrow ledge halfway up the canyon wall. "Go," Dorian shouted, giving Seraphina a boost up onto the ledge before pulling himself up after her. They scrambled up the rocky slope, the blaster fire growing more intense as the rock-tusk soldiers realized what they were doing. Dorian fired behind him, but it was clear that they were outnumbered. "Keep moving," Dorian urged, pushing Seraphina forward as they climbed higher. The ledge was narrow, barely wide enough for both of them, and the drop below was steep. One wrong move and they'd fall to their deaths. But Seraphina didn't hesitate. She moved with the grace of someone who had been trained for this, her hands and feet finding purchase on the rocks with ease. Dorian was impressed. Most royals would have panicked by now, but Seraphina showed no signs of fear. Finally, they reached the top of the ledge, pulling themselves up onto a flat plateau that overlooked the canyon. From here, they had a clear view of the rock-tusk soldiers below, who were now regrouping for another assault. Dorian knelt down, catching his breath as he reloaded his blaster. Seraphina stood beside him, her eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of reinforcements. "They'll be on us again in minutes," Dorian said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "But we've got the high ground now. That gives us a fighting chance." Seraphina nodded, but there was a new intensity in her gaze. "We need to find a way to disrupt their communication. If they can't coordinate, we might be able to slip past them." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "You've got a plan?" She didn't hesitate. The Rakta used short-range frequencies for their ground troops. I can scramble their signal if we get close enough to their command unit." Dorian stared at her for a moment, taken aback by her confidence. "You know how to do that." Serafina gave him a sharp look. "I wasn't raised to sit on a throne, Captain. I was raised to lead." It was the first real glimpse he had gotten of the woman behind the title, and for a moment Dorian felt a flicker of something unexpected admiration. "All right," he said, standing up and adjusting his weapon. "Let's scramble their comms and get the hell out of here." Together, they moved along the ridge, preparing for the next stage of the battle, each of them realizing that this was no longer just a mission, it was survival. The cold winds of Exianus cut through the narrow canyon like knives, whipping around the jagged rocks and sending the loose gravel scattering underfoot. The silence that followed the skirmish was unsettling. Captain Dorian Vale and Princess Serafina stood on the narrow ledge, their chests heaving from the exertion of their escape. The Rakta soldiers below had been temporarily scattered, but Dorian knew that this brief moment of peace was fragile. Soon they would regroup, and the hunt would begin again. Above them, the sky was a deep, foreboding crimson, the twin moons casting an eerie glow across the barren landscape. The entire planet seemed like a relic of an ancient war, with its broken mountains and ghostly valleys. The once proud civilization that had inhabited Shyness was long gone, leaving only ruins and dust behind. It was fitting, Dorian thought grimly, that this was where the Rakta had set up one of their most fortified strongholds. He turned to Serafina, who was crouched beside him, her violet eyes scanning the canyon floor. Her silver hair, which had been perfectly arranged when he first saw her in the cell, was now wild, framing her face in a way that made her seem both regal and fierce at the same time. Her breathing was steady, her expression focused. The princess was handling this ordeal better than most soldiers he'd fought beside, and certainly better than any noble he'd ever met. "We're not out of this yet," Dorian said, breaking the silence, his voice low but urgent. "The Rakta will be back with reinforcements, and if we're caught on this ledge, we're done for." Serafina nodded, her expression unreadable. "I know. What's the next move?" Dorian crouched beside her, pulling up the holo map on his wrist communicator. The holographic projection flickered to life, displaying the layout of the canyon and the surrounding area. His finger traced a route through the narrowest part of the gorge. "There's a passage here that leads to the other side of the canyon. It's risky tight, with only one way in and out, but it's the fastest way to the extraction point." Serafina studied the map for a moment, her brows knitting together in thought. "And what if the Rakta catch up with us before we make it through?" Dorian met her gaze. "We'll have to make sure they don't." She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just nodded once and looked out at the landscape again. "Lead the way." They moved quickly, staying low and using the rocks as cover. Dorian took point, his blaster at the ready, while Serafina followed closely behind, her footfalls barely audible. The canyon was a labyrinth of jagged stones and narrow pathways, with shadows that seemed to move and shift with every step. Above, the Rakta drones continued to circle, their searchlights sweeping across the ground like predatory birds hunting their prey. Every time one passed overhead, Dorian's grip tightened on his blaster, his pulse quickening. The passage he had marked on the map was less than a mile away, but the journey felt longer, each step weighed down by the knowledge that the Rakta could be on them at any moment. Dorian's senses were heightened, his body thrumming with the adrenaline that had become so familiar to him over the years. Yet this time there was something different, something more urgent gnawing at him. It wasn't just the mission anymore. It wasn't just about getting the princess out alive, it was about something deeper. He wasn't sure what to make of it yet, but he couldn't deny the pull. As they moved, Dorian stole a glance at Serafina. She was keeping pace with him, her eyes sharp and focused, her movements fluid despite the hostile terrain. There was something mesmerizing about her in moments like this, a contradiction of beauty and fierceness, grace and defiance. He'd expected her to be fragile, someone who needed constant protection, but she had proven herself to be a survivor, every bit as determined as he was. She wasn't just royalty, she was a warrior in her own right. Suddenly Serafina stopped, her hand darting out to grab Dorian's arm. Her grip was firm, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wait." Dorian froze, following her gaze to a narrow outcrop above them. At first he didn't see anything, just more rocks and shadows. But then a faint shimmer caught his eye, a cloaked Rakta patrol, moving silently along the ridge. The enemy soldiers were using optical camouflage, blending into the rocky terrain, their movements almost invisible to the naked eye. "How did you?" Dorian began, but Serafina cut him off with a quick gesture, her eyes locked on the patrol. "Rakta armor has a slight distortion when it's in motion," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "I've seen it before. We need to wait until they pass." Dorian nodded, impressed once again by her sharp instincts. They crouched behind a boulder, their bodies pressed close to the cold stone as the patrol moved overhead, silent and deadly. The tension was palpable, every second dragging out as the Rakta soldiers scanned the area with their advanced optics. Dorian could feel Serafina's breath beside him, steady and controlled, even as his own heart hammered in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the patrol moved on, disappearing into the distance. Dorian let out a quiet breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've got sharp eyes, princess." Serafina glanced at him, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You learn quickly when your life depends on it." Dorian couldn't help but admire her calm under pressure. She wasn't just surviving, she was adapting, thinking ahead. It was a quality that most soldiers took years to develop, and here she was, doing it effortlessly. He had to remind himself that she wasn't just some helpless royal, she was the heir to one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. And yet, standing here beside him in the middle of this godforsaken canyon, she seemed more real than any princess he'd ever imagined. They continued their journey, navigating through the canyon with renewed urgency. The Rakta patrols were becoming more frequent now, their drones flying lower, their searchlights more aggressive. Dorian knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy locked onto their position, and when that happened, escape would become nearly impossible. Finally, they reached the passage, the narrow crack in the canyon wall that Dorian had marked earlier. It was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, the jagged rocks scraping at their armor as they entered. The air inside was cold and damp, the walls slick with moisture from some unseen source. Dorian could feel the weight of the canyon pressing down on them, the claustrophobic space making every sound seem louder, every breath more labored. "We'll be out of here soon," Dorian said quietly, more to reassure himself than Serafina. Serafina said nothing, but Dorian could sense her tension. She was as aware as he was that this narrow passage was both their escape route and a potential death trap. If the Rakta discovered them here, there would be no place to run, no way to fight. As they moved deeper into the passage, Dorian's communicator crackled to life. It was Kara, his second in command. "Captain, we've got trouble." Her voice came through, the static crackling in his ear. Dorian paused, pressing his fingers to his earpiece. "What kind of trouble?" "Rakta reinforcements. A lot of them. They're closing in on your position. We've been trying to jam their comms, but they've adapted. Our interference is only delaying them. We've still got the extraction point secured, but you need to move. Now." Dorian's jaw tightened. "Understood. We're on our way." He glanced at Serafina, who was already watching him with those piercing violet eyes. She didn't need to ask what was happening, she could read the situation as well as he could. They were running out of time. "We need to pick up the pace," Dorian said, his voice grim. "The Rakta are closing in, and we've got less than 10 minutes before they find us." Serafina nodded, her face set in determination. "Lead the way." They pushed forward, the passage narrowing even further until they had to duck and squeeze through the tightest sections. The darkness was almost complete, and Dorian could barely see more than a few feet ahead of him. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to hurry, but he knew that rushing through this would be just as dangerous. One wrong move, and they could trigger a rock slide or worse, fall into one of the many hidden ravines that crisscrossed the canyon floor. Then, without warning, the passage opened up, spilling them out onto a high ledge overlooking the vast expanse of the canyon below. The sight that greeted them was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Rakta forces were everywhere. Below, dozens of Rakta soldiers were sweeping through the canyon, their armor glinting in the faint light of the moons. Drones hovered above them, their searchlights slicing through the darkness as they methodically scanned the ground. The sheer number of troops was overwhelming. There was no way they could fight their way through this, not without help. "Damn it," Dorian muttered under his breath, his eyes darting across the canyon, searching for a way out. "We're surrounded," Serafina said quietly, her voice steady despite the grim situation. Dorian nodded, his mind racing. He activated his communicator again. Kara, we've got eyes on the Rock-Tough forces. There's too many. What's your status? We're still holding the extraction point, Kara replied, her voice strained. But we've got company. I don't know how long we can hold them off. Dorian clenched his jaw. They were so close, and yet the odds were rapidly stacking against them. His mind flickered through a dozen different plans, each one more desperate than the last. And then, a thought struck him, a crazy, dangerous thought. He turned to Seraphina. How good are you with alien tech? Seraphina raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face. I know enough. Why? Dorian gestured to the drones above the Rakta troops. We need a distraction. If we can hack into their drone network, we can scramble their search patterns, buy ourselves enough time to get to the extraction point. Seraphina's eyes narrowed in thought. It's risky. Their drones are heavily encrypted. If I make a mistake, they'll know exactly where we are. Dorian met her gaze, his voice firm. We don't have any other choice. Can you do it? For a moment, Seraphina was silent, her mind working through the calculations. Then, with a small nod, she said, I'll need access to one of the drones. And I'll need time. Dorian's heart pounded in his chest, but he gave a quick nod. I'll get you that drone. You just focus on the hack. They moved quickly, using the ledge as cover as they edged their way around the canyon. Dorian's eyes never left the drones above, his blaster at the ready. The Rakta soldiers below were still sweeping the area, but they hadn't spotted them yet. They were close, so close, and Dorian knew that any second now, their luck could run out. Finally, they reached a small outcropping that gave them a better vantage point of the nearest drone. It was hovering just above the canyon floor, its searchlights moving in a steady, mechanical rhythm. Dorian could feel Seraphina tense beside him as she readied herself. On my signal, Dorian whispered, his eyes locked on the drone. 3, 2, 1, now. Seraphina moved with startling speed, activating her wrist device and sending a pulse of energy toward the drone. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, with a soft whir, the drone's lights flickered and dimmed. It hovered in place, its systems temporarily disabled. Go, Dorian said, covering Seraphina as she darted forward, her fingers flying across the controls of her wrist device. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity as Dorian watched the Rakta soldiers below. They hadn't noticed the drone yet, but it was only a matter of time. Hurry, he muttered under his breath, his eyes flicking between Seraphina and the soldiers. I'm almost there, Seraphina replied, her voice tight with concentration. Suddenly, the drone's lights flickered again, and then, with a soft beep, it powered back on, but its movements were erratic now, its search patterns scrambled. Got it, Seraphina said, standing up and moving back toward Dorian. That should give us a few minutes. Dorian grinned, adrenaline surging through him. Then let's make those minutes count. They didn't waste any more time. With the drones now flying in random patterns, the Rakta soldiers were thrown into disarray, their communications filled with confusion. It was the opening Dorian and Seraphina needed. Together they sprinted down the ledge, moving with purpose toward the extraction point. Every step felt like a race against time, but for the first time since the mission had begun, Dorian felt like they had a real chance of making it out alive. As they rounded the final bend in the canyon, the extraction point came into view, a small clearing where the Stormrider was waiting, its engines powered up and ready for takeoff. Kara and the remaining members of the squad were holding the perimeter, their blasters firing at the approaching Rakta forces. Go, Dorian shouted, pushing Seraphina ahead of him as they dashed toward the ship. The Rakta soldiers were closing in fast, but Dorian and Seraphina didn't stop. Blaster fire erupted around them, the air thick with the sounds of battle, but they kept running, their eyes locked on the ship ahead. With a final burst of speed, they reached the Stormrider, and Kara was there to pull them aboard, her face flushed with relief. Get us out of here, Dorian shouted, slamming his fist on the control panel as the ramp closed behind them. The ship's engines roared to life, and with a surge of power, the Stormrider lifted off, leaving the Rakta forces behind in a cloud of dust. As they ascended into the night sky, the tension that had gripped Dorian's chest for so long finally began to ease. They had done it. Against all odds, they had made it out alive. He turned to Seraphina, who was standing beside him, her eyes still sharp, her body still tense. Nice work back there, Dorian said, his voice low. Serafina met his gaze, her expression softening for the first time since they'd met. Likewise, Captain. Dorian felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just relief, it was something deeper, something unexpected. But there would be time to think about that later. For now, they were safe. For now, they were free. And as the storm riders soared into the vast expanse of space, Dorian couldn't help but wonder what the future held for them both. As a token of our gratitude, you will be granted the title of Honorary Knight of Vialora, the Emperor announced, his voice carrying across the hall. And you will be awarded lands within the Empire, should you choose to stay among us. Dorian's heart sank. The idea of staying on Vialora, of becoming entangled in the Empire's politics and nobility, was the last thing he wanted. His place was out there, in the stars, on the battlefield. He wasn't cut out for this life. But before he could respond, a voice interrupted the ceremony. No. The single word cut through the air like a blade, silencing the hall. All eyes turned toward Serafina, who had stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. Father, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Captain Vale deserves more than a title or land. He deserves the truth. The Emperor frowned, clearly taken aback by his daughter's interruption. Serafina, what are you? But Serafina wasn't finished. She turned to face Dorian, her violet eyes locking onto his. In that moment, the entire hall seemed to fade away, and it was just the two of them standing in the aftermath of everything they had been through together. I owe you my life, Dorian, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. But more than that, I owe you my heart. You didn't just save me, you showed me what it means to be free. Free from the weight of expectation, free from the chains of duty. Dorian's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what was happening, wasn't sure if he was hearing her right. This wasn't just gratitude. This was something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to fully consider until now. You gave me my life back, Serafina continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. And for that, I offer you mine. My body, my soul, everything I am, I offer to you. If you'll have me. A stunned silence fell over the hall. Dorian could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, but all he could see was Serafina. Her words hung in the air, charged with an intensity that left him breathless. For a moment, he was speechless. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced to make sense of what was happening. He had never expected this, never imagined that the bond they had forged in battle could lead to something so profound, so personal. But as he looked into Serafina's eyes, he knew the truth. He had felt it growing inside him ever since Ixionis, this connection, this pull toward her. It wasn't just duty anymore. It was something far more powerful. And in that moment, he made his decision. I don't need a title, Dorian said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't need land. All I need is you. The hall erupted in gasps, whispers spreading like wildfire through the crowd. The Emperor stood frozen, his expression unreadable. But Dorian didn't care. All that mattered was the woman standing before him, the woman who had offered him everything. Serafina stepped forward, her hand reaching for his. When their fingers touched, it was as though the world had shifted beneath them, and for the first time Dorian felt truly at peace. Together they stood before the Empire, their fates intertwined, their hearts bound by something far stronger than duty. The hours that followed were a blur of ceremony and formality, but Dorian barely registered any of it. His thoughts were consumed by Serafina, by the enormity of what had just happened. They had defied every expectation, every tradition, and in doing so, they had created something entirely their own. When the formalities were finally over, and the crowd had begun to disperse, Dorian found himself standing alone on one of the palace's many balconies, overlooking the sprawling city below. The cool night air brushed against his skin, carrying with it the distant sounds of life in the capital. But his mind was far from the bustling city. Footsteps approached behind him, and he turned to see Serafina, her royal robes replaced with something simpler, more comfortable. She looked less like a princess, and more like the woman he had fought beside in the canyon, the woman who had stolen his heart. Are you all right? She asked, her voice soft as she joined him at the railing. Dorian smiled, though it was a small, tired smile. I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of this. Serafina looked out over the city, her expression thoughtful. So am I. But I meant what I said, Dorian. I don't want to live a life dictated by others. I don't want to be bound by titles or traditions. I want to be with you. Dorian turned to face her fully, his heart swelling with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Are you sure? This isn't going to be easy. We're defying an empire. Your father. My father will come to understand, Serafina interrupted, her eyes shining with determination. And even if he doesn't, I don't care. I'm choosing my own path now. Dorian reached out, taking her hand in his. And what about your people? Your empire? Serafina smiled, a soft, wistful smile. The empire will endure, with or without me. My people will understand that I'm following my heart. And if they don't, then I'll help them see that the world isn't as rigid as they think it is. Dorian chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. You really are something, you know that. Serafina raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment, Captain? Take it however you want, Dorian replied, pulling her closer, his voice lowering as he spoke. I just know that I've never met anyone like you. And I don't think I ever will again. Serafina's eyes softened, and for a moment they stood in silence, their foreheads touching, the weight of the world falling away around them. Then don't let me go, she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Dorian's grip tightened on her hand, and in that moment he knew he never would. They had defied an empire, yes, but they had also found something far more valuable, each other. And as the stars twinkled above them, Dorian realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a man in love. And that was the greatest victory of all. The days following Serafina's public declaration of love were a whirlwind of political maneuvering, tense meetings behind closed doors, and endless discussions about what the future would hold. For the first time in his career, Captain Dorian Vale found himself navigating not through enemy lines or dangerous battlefields, but through the even more treacherous landscape of the Valoran court. Arcanis Prime, the heart of the Valoran Empire, was as beautiful as it was dangerous in its own way. The spires of the city glittered in the sunlight, pristine and elegant, while beneath the surface, power plays unfolded with the precision of a well-executed military operation. For all its grandeur, the court was a place of sharp edges, where words could cut deeper than any blade, and loyalty was as fragile as glass. Dorian had fought wars all across the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him for this. At the center of it all was Serafina, poised and resolute in the face of the storm she had created. She had stood by her decision with unshakable grace, facing down the whispers of the nobles, the skeptical glances of the military elite, and even the quiet disapproval of her father, Emperor Kalen Valoran. Dorian had never been prouder of anyone in his life. Yet, as much as Serafina seemed untouched by the swirling chaos, Dorian could see the toll it was taking on her. Every day brought new challenges, another courtier questioning her choice, another advisor whispering about the dangers of defying tradition. And while she met each of these obstacles with a calm strength, Dorian knew her well enough now to see the exhaustion creeping in behind her violet eyes. For his part, Dorian felt like a foreigner in this world of politics and pomp. He had always been a man of action, of simple, direct decisions made in the heat of battle. Now, he was being asked to navigate a world where every word, every gesture carried weight. The titles and honors the Emperor had bestowed upon him felt like chains rather than rewards. The court regarded him as an outsider, an upstart soldier who had no business standing beside the princess, let alone claiming her heart. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when it was just him and Serafina, alone in the quiet corners of the palace, away from prying eyes. In those moments, the weight of the court and the empire fell away, leaving only the two of them, bound by something far stronger than politics or tradition. It was in one of those moments, late in the evening after yet another long day of diplomatic wrangling, that Dorian found Serafina standing on the palace balcony, staring out at the glittering city below. The air was cool, the night sky above clear and dotted with stars. Dorian watched her for a moment from the doorway, her figure illuminated by the soft light of the moons. She looked so regal, so impossibly distant in her elegance, and yet there was a vulnerability about her in that moment that tugged at his heart. He stepped forward, his boots barely making a sound on the marble floor. "You're still out here," he said softly. Serafina didn't turn, but a small smile curved her lips. I needed some air. It's quieter out here. Dorian came to stand beside her, leaning his hands on the balcony's stone railing. The view was breathtaking. Arcanus Prime stretched out below them, its towers glowing softly in the twilight, the distant sea reflecting the light of the moons. But Dorian's attention was focused solely on Seraphina. "You've been dealing with a lot lately," he said, his voice gentle. "I know this isn't easy." Seraphina let out a soft sigh, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she leaned against the railing. "It was never going to be easy, Dorian. I knew that the moment I made my choice. But it's harder than I thought it would be." Dorian frowned, his chest tightening. He hated seeing her like this, worn down by the pressures of a life she hadn't asked for, a life she had been born into without a choice. "If I could make it easier for you." "You do," she interrupted, turning to face him. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of tenderness and exhaustion. "Just having you here makes all of this bearable. You're the reason I can face all of it, the court, my father, the expectations. You give me strength, Dorian." He shook his head slightly, feeling unworthy of her words. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for all this, Seraphina. I'm not cut out for this life. These people, they don't trust me. They don't want me here." Seraphina stepped closer, her fingers gently touching his arm. "You're more than strong enough. You've faced worse than this. You've survived wars, saved lives, and you're not alone in this. We're in this together." Dorian felt the warmth of her touch, the steady pulse of her belief in him, and it grounded him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He had always been a man who stood alone, who relied on his own strength and instincts to survive. But Seraphina had shown him something different, a partnership, a bond that was stronger than any battle he had ever fought. They stood in silence for a long moment, the cool breeze rustling Seraphina's hair. The weight of the empire, the court, and the expectations that came with them all seemed to melt away in that moment. It was just the two of them, together, standing at the edge of a world they didn't quite fit into, but were determined to navigate. Finally, Seraphina broke the silence. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Dorian blinked, surprised by the question. "Leaving?" Seraphina turned back to the stars, her gaze distant. "Yes, leaving all of this behind. The court, the expectations, the endless scrutiny. Do you ever think about just disappearing into the stars?" Dorian studied her for a moment, her words resonating with a deep truth he hadn't wanted to admit. He had spent the last few weeks wrestling with the pull of the stars, the call of the freedom he had always known, the freedom that came from living on the edge of danger, from going where he was needed, and not being tied down to any one place. But there was also Seraphina. "I think about it," he admitted quietly. "I think about getting away from all of this, but I can't imagine doing it without you." Seraphina's lips quirked into a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You wouldn't have to. We could go together." Dorian's heart skipped a beat. "You're serious?" She turned to face him fully now, her expression steady, but filled with a quiet resolve. "I've been thinking about it a lot. I love my people, Dorian. I love my empire. But I'm tired of living a life dictated by others. I want to live a life that's my own, a life that we choose together." Dorian stared at her, his mind racing. The idea of leaving, of abandoning the weight of the empire, the court, the endless expectations was both terrifying and exhilarating. He had never imagined that Seraphina would be willing to walk away from it all, to leave behind the life she had been born into. But now, looking at her, he realized just how much she had already changed. Seraphina wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a woman who had tasted freedom, who had fought for her life and found something more valuable than titles or crowns. And she was offering that freedom to him. "What about your father?" Dorian asked, though his voice was softer now, more hopeful. "What about your people? Won't they?" "They'll survive," Seraphina said, cutting him off gently. "The Valoran Empire is strong. It's built on centuries of tradition and leadership. My father will find a way to move forward without me. My people will understand eventually." Dorian took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always lived his life on the edge, never staying in one place for too long, never letting himself get too close to anyone or anything that could hold him down. But now, for the first time, he had someone worth holding on to. And if Seraphina was willing to leave it all behind for him, how could he do anything less? "Where would we go?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Seraphina smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "Anywhere we want. There's a whole galaxy out there, Dorian, We could explore the farthest reaches of the stars, discover new worlds, new cultures. We could make our own way, on our own terms. Dorian's heart swelled with a mix of excitement and fear. It was a dangerous, uncertain future she was offering, but it was also full of possibility. For the first time in his life, Dorian saw a future that wasn't defined by war or duty. A future where he could be more than just a soldier, a future where he could build something with Seraphina, something real and lasting. He reached out, cupping her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheeks. "You really mean it," he said softly, wonder filling his voice. Seraphina leaned into his touch, her eyes shining with a mixture of love and determination. "I mean it, Dorian. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to leave this life behind and start a new one with you." Dorian's breath caught in his throat. He had never imagined this, never imagined that his life could take such a turn. But here it was, right in front of him, a chance for something more, something deeper than anything he had ever known. And in that moment, he made his choice. "Then let's go," he whispered, his voice filled with conviction. "Let's leave tonight." Seraphina's eyes widened in surprise. "Tonight?" Dorian grinned, a spark of mischief lighting up his features. "Why not? There's nothing holding us here anymore. We've already made our decision. Let's get out of here before anyone can stop us." Seraphina stared at him for a moment, and then a laugh bubbled up from her throat, a laugh of pure, unfiltered joy. "You're serious, aren't you?" "Dead serious," Dorian replied, his grin widening. "Pack your things. We're getting out of here." Seraphina's heart soared, and without another word, she threw her arms around Dorian, pulling him into a fierce embrace. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt truly free from the weight of her title, free from the expectations of her people, free to choose her own destiny. They held each other for a long moment, the stars twinkling above them, the future stretching out before them like an endless expanse of possibilities. When they finally pulled apart, Seraphina's eyes were shining with excitement. "I'll meet you at the hangar in an hour," she said, her voice breathless with anticipation. "Don't be late, Captain." Dorian chuckled, his heart racing with exhilaration. "I wouldn't dream of it, Your Highness." The hangar was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the ship's engines and the occasional rustle of the wind. The Storm Rider stood at the center of the bay, its sleek form gleaming under the dim lights. Dorian was already there, pacing back and forth near the entrance, his pulse thrumming with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. He had told Kara and the crew what was happening. They had taken the news with a mixture of shock and support, though Kara had given him one of her trademark sharp glances, clearly still processing it all. But now, as the minutes ticked by, all Dorian could think about was Seraphina. He kept glancing toward the entrance, half expecting someone to burst through the doors and stop them, to tell him that this had all been a mistake. And then, she appeared. Seraphina strode into the hangar, her simple travel clothes a stark contrast to the regal robes she usually wore. She carried a small bag slung over her shoulder, her silver hair tied back in a loose braid. But it was her expression that caught Dorian's attention. Her eyes were bright, her face lit with an excitement that mirrored his own. "You're late," Dorian teased, though his voice was filled with affection. Seraphina rolled her eyes, a playful smirk on her lips. "I'm worth the wait." Dorian chuckled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders as he watched her approach. She was here. She was really doing this. They didn't waste any more time. Together they boarded the Storm Rider, the crew already prepared for takeoff. The ship hummed to life, its engines roaring as it lifted off the ground, rising into the night sky. As the palace and the capital city faded below them, Dorian and Seraphina stood side by side in the cockpit, watching as the stars spread out before them. The future was wide open now, unpredictable, dangerous, and full of unknowns. But for the first time, Dorian wasn't afraid of it. He turned to Seraphina, his heart swelling with love for the woman who had changed his life in ways he had never imagined. "Where to first?" he asked, his voice soft. Seraphina smiled, her eyes filled with excitement and possibility. "Anywhere, everywhere. The stars are ours now, Dorian." And with that, the Storm Rider shot into the vast expanse of space, leaving behind the weight of the past and charting a course for a future they would create together. As the stars streaked past the viewport, Dorian took Seraphina's hand in his, a sense of peace settling over him. They had left behind an empire, a life of duty and expectation, but they had gained something far greater. They had gained each other. And as they journeyed into the unknown, Dorian knew one thing for certain: no matter where the stars led them, they would face it together. The galaxy was vast, and their adventure had only just begun,